Chapter Tessera. Solution. Logically, no one expected, especially KLEIO, that she would live to see the following morning. So far, very few people had woken up after the world had ended, still significantly fewer than of those who were shot. In contradiction to cosmic probability and any rationality, she awoke unscathed. Once again, she missed the memory of how she came to be here, in an unfamiliar place, in a strange apartment, and a strange bed. Her skull throbbed like an internal aftershock of the destruction, and right now, it might as well have been the after effects of the djinn. From the room next door, she heard music. It was poison to her auditory canal. She could only guess where she was. The room was small, the bed much too large for the space. There was a mess of papers, empty cans and bottles, and dirty laundry. This was clearly the apartment of a bachelor. She didn't have to be a psychic for that. A bachelor who did not expect visitors or possibly thought to take her home. The certainty that it was Leon came when she heard him whistling to the music. She took the pillow from under her head and pressed it to her face. It smelled a little, but muffled the sound and helped her hide out of shame. Had she really crashed like that and ended up with Leon? Had someone slipped something into her drink?
What the hell is happening here?
She asked herself. What had really happened, and what in her imagination? She got to her feet, first cautiously to make sure her head would allow it. At least she still had her clothes on, so there was probably nothing to regret. And yet, she felt like something had happened, called it a hunch. Only what it told her couldn't possibly be. She took 3 steps from the bed to the door, opened it, and the smell of toasted bread, eggs, and bacon invaded her nose. Leon felt unobserved and half-heartedly sang along. Of all the songs in the discography of mankind, the one that played was I Got You Babe by Sonny and Cher. The memory of the movie Groundhog Day evoked her childhood at the same time as it raised the hairs on the back of her neck. At the fear, she was actually stuck in a kind of time warp, only worse. She would rather relive the same day infinitely, instead of a single one as it lay behind her. She refrained from asking herself if this was meant to be a failed innuendo, and walked behind him. If she didn't want to scare him to death, she still had to make her presence known. She cleared her throat, which was what scared to death.
Oh my God, it's you.
He caught himself.
I mean, you're awake. Perfect. We'll have breakfast in a minute.
She looked down at the laminated floor, a little embarrassed, saw that it was pretty dirty, and kept silent rather than ask even now how she got here.
I hope you're not a vegan. For those, I'm afraid I have little.
He interspersed as humorously as possible.
Not really.
She confessed.
I tried for quite some time.
Curiously, he turned to her again from the stove.
You couldn't stand it?
I had to learn that the problem of overconsumption goes deeper than the meat industry. That sustainable and fair meat farming can be better for the environment than bad vegetable farming, monocultures, etc.
Leon grimaced as if uncomfortable with the following.
Eggs and bacon are both from Aldi.
Fair.
KLEIO replied meekly.
Have you actually recovered?
Leon then wanted to know. KLEIO gave no answer, did not know from what, if, and how she recovered. Whether something had happened between them, although she didn't think he was the sort to take advantage of such a situation. Somehow, he seemed to sense her insecurity, and he pleaded his innocence as if he were on trial.
If you're blacking out, which I would understand, we couldn't figure out where you were staying. That's why we transported you here with a taxi and put you in my bed as you are. I slept on the couch.
He pointed past her to the other half of the kitchen, which was also the living room, and where there was a grey sofa that hardly looked as if it would be exceedingly healthy to sleep on.
Thank you.
There was nothing left for her to do more than thank him as sincerely as possible.
I wouldn't have taken you for a coma drinker.
Then came cynically from him, which made her feel embarrassed. She thought to defend herself somehow.
I don't know. Maybe someone put something in my drink.
Her head was getting warm.
Then it must have happened after I gave you the can. The bartender opened it in front of me. Otherwise, only I remain as a culprit.
He reconstructed the alleged course of events.
You were actually back to normal before Gustav went crazy. Then you stood with those guys, all of a sudden, and got drunk?
Then this part had really happened. So it was now clear that something was very, very wrong if unthinkable things and reality were so difficult to distinguish from each other. She felt sweat condensing on her forehead and dizzy all of a sudden.
Is the heater on?
Are you too warm? I can turn on the air conditioning.
He offered.
Can I open a window?
They're already open.
He admitted, irritated. All of a sudden, a biting sound from outside rumbled in her ears.
What is that?
She asked. It sounded like lumberjacks were at work outside the window. Leon shrugged his shoulders.
Someone will be out mowing the lawn, I guess.
He assumed. KLEIO rose from her chair.
It was snowing yesterday, wasn't it?
What are you talking about?
Asked Leon, laughing in confusion.
It's the middle of July.
As a rule, KLEIO was quite capable of judging whether someone was pulling her leg, and Leon in no way gave the impression that this was his intention. So either his sarcasm was on level 1000, or KLEIO was truly losing her mind. Defiantly, she got up and walked to the window, expecting the dreary winter of the city from yesterday. Startled into second gear. She remembered exactly in what cold she had arrived, how a group of children were throwing slush at each other by the wayside, how the snow was falling. Now people were walking around in summer clothes. The asphalt almost glowed in the sun rays. A man was mowing the lawn in front of the opposite house. It was almost as if she could hear the grass humming, as if it was crying out under the guillotine of the mower. A clamor that KLEIO mentally suffered through when she realized that she was wearing a white ruffled summer dress herself instead of the winter outfit from yesterday. She felt everything inside her tense up, and the shock pulled the strength out of her legs. Gradually, Leon had to worry. He obviously had fallen for a mentally disturbed woman. At the moment, his primary concern was for her well-being. She could merely question where the toilet was, and he explained it to her when she already fled in that direction, and got rid of the dubious stomach contents of leftover curry sausage and alcohol.
I hope you like some breakfast anyway.
Leon began when she returned, sounding himself as if he doubted it.
Might do you some good, even if you don't want to believe it right now.
Pro forma, he had set the glass dining table with a selection of what his pantry had to offer.
I found some more fruit, if your vegan stomach prefers those.
She instantly waved it off.
Acid would be fatal now, I think. I'd rather have something fatty.
At her command, he fixed a plate with the classic of the hangover breakfast, consisting of fried eggs and bacon with 2 pancakes. Completely famished, she threw herself at it. Not at all like someone who had just thrown up, but rather someone who survived Armageddon and a bullet to the head. Both had happened somehow, hadn't they? The madness couldn't have happened merely in her mind. What was growing inside her was more than a phantasmagoria. She was anxious to consult a doctor.
It must be me,
She thought.
Something is not right in my head. Since yesterday.
And what about today? What was today? What was yesterday? What about tomorrow? What the hell was happening here? Questions rolled over in her head. What was happening outside became beside the point. She stopped eating, stared into the emptiness, became more and more spaced out, as if she were gradually anesthetized. To Leon, she made an increasingly passive impression. The longer, the more she withdrew, further into herself. He did talk to her, and she seemed to listen. In truth, his voice became more muffled, as if she were submerged in water, and constantly moving away from him and their exchange, in ways that were incomprehensible. A conventional housefly buzzed around them both. For a fleeting moment, that one gained more attention from KLEIO than Leon. She stared downright at the insect, having never experienced it before with such eyes. She could see every notch, every fiber in the structure of the chitinous carapace as if she were looking at it under a microscope. Her gaze penetrated the critter, and she got the impression that the fly was becoming transparent. Somehow she found this strangely funny, and a dreamy smile came over her lips. Leon did not understand what was so funny about what he had just said, and it escaped him that her mind was completely elsewhere. She was here and at the same time not, in an in-between space where suddenly everything became possible. KLEIO's mind focused incessantly on the fly, and before she knew it, she became the fly. Not like Jeff Goldblum in a Cronenberg-esque mutation. Her body was still sitting there. Yet, somehow, whether it was sheer will or unwillingness, her mind transferred into the insect's body. Now KLEIO was buzzing around the breakfast table, a considerable part of her, for she no longer felt herself sitting there, rather saw herself there while flying over Leon's forearm. The hair on it passed underneath her like trees before the arm all at once lifted up, whereupon KLEIO had to take evasive action to avoid collision.
"Watch it, Leon,"
she called out to him, but he didn't hear or understand her. No human being understood the language of flies. It was more than a language barrier that caused his waving. His movements became offensive. In his reality, he was flailing wildly around. With KLEIO's new perception, it felt like lumbering forces of nature, as if he weighed thousands and thousands of tons, as if continental plates were shifting to form a titanic atlas. KLEIO felt the vibrations all the way into her exoskeleton. Fortunately, she could fly, with playful ease, dodging the inert monster called Leon, but the rush really rubbed her the wrong way.
"Leon, stop it. It's me, KLEIO,"
she hummed. It was at that moment of carelessness that Leon caught her full on with his right, and the brief, extremely unpleasant feeling of being crushed disappeared.
Ah!
cried Leon, falling backwards from his chair in shock. He straightened up, looked toward the breakfast table where KLEIO was sitting, unconcerned, as if nothing had happened.
Take it easy, KLEIO,
Leon said, not to her but to himself. Leon was no longer Leon. Leon was KLEIO. KLEIO was Leon.
"But where is Leon?"
KLEIO asked herself inside his body. He had disappeared in the same way as most likely the fly did before, where to could only be guessed. She came back to his feet and looked across the table, where her body sat unconcerned, as if she was immersed in infinitely profound thoughts, when there must have been just emptiness. Again, KLEIO paid a visit to the bathroom, knowing where it lay. This time in the body of a man, and not to throw up, but for an aghast look in the mirror, in which she saw beyond a shadow of a doubt. She was Leon. At first, she began to scream in a man's voice. His voice, before the madness made her laugh. The sheer lack of understanding was reflected in a bipolarly disturbed way, and in a strange face. She slapped herself several times, feeling the pain in a strange body that felt so deceptively real as in her own. And when, after several hesitations, she administered a fist, she was suddenly back at the table with Leon, and regained control.
Are you all right?
asked Leon anxiously. It was only then that KLEIO realized that she was back in the familiar environment of her mind. In her body, sitting on the chair across from Leon, sitting at breakfast together. She returned from absence.
"I don't really know,"
she confessed. Rather didn't know at all. None of what was happening here made even the remotest sense to her. More, she removed herself from any sense. Was it the after-effects of some insidious drug she had been given at the party? But then how could all the strangeness before that be explained? KLEIO had to face the facts. She was truly losing her mind. In the truest sense of this definition, it escaped her to what extent. Or she repressed it. She avoided Leon's gaze, categorically avoided any sight, fearing to become any of it again, and stared at the table, fervently hoping that it would not turn her into it.
You're a little pale,
came from Leon, and KLEIO felt able to see the sound waves of his voice, which spread from his mouth like concentric circles on the surface of water.
I'm not so incredibly well.
She replied more tearfully than usual for her.
The only thing else I can offer you is a crisp bread. Maybe it's better for your stomach.
The problem was guaranteed to have little to do with her stomach.
No. I've just had enough.
She literally squeezed out, trying to maintain the emptiness of her thoughts. Leon failed to realize that something was very wrong with her. For him, she merely had a heavy hangover, so it remained rationally explainable, after she had to be dragged to him last night because she was simply unresponsive. He slathered butter neatly on his Scandinavian crisp bread, a drizzle of jam for good measure.
You're still pretty out of it, I see,
he then commented, taking a bit into the delicacy with relish. It was the crunch of his bite that drove away every other thought. The sound bored into her hearing like a drill, straight into her brain, and the vibrational shock began to spread from her. First the table shook, the tablecloth wobbled. Then all of a sudden, the house shook, the city, then the world. A cataclysmic earthquake, beyond all scales, engulfed the planet. People fled through the streets in panic, but no distance they knew was enough to escape it.
What the hell is that?
Screamed Leon fearfully from the epicenter before the house collapsed.
Then put your little hand in mine. There ain't no hill or mountain we can't fly.
Up to here, KLEIO had felt a faint hope. Soon her perception would return to reality, without a glimmer how far she would still move away from what she understood by reality. She was astonished when she was able to look at herself again from the outside, just as she had woken up and opened the door of Leon's room, while he was preparing breakfast and, of all things, Sonny and Cher's I Got You Babe was playing. What might she be now? In which body had she manifested? Time stood still, and she saw herself as on an unflattering photo. Whatever she might be in, she began to move backwards away from her still life. First through Leon's apartment, before a tunnel formed around her. It wasn't her who moved. The room enveloped itself around her. Present disappeared in a whirlpool of reflections, faster and faster, until she was traveling at the speed of light to an unknown destination. KLEIO felt the air resistance grew stronger, as if she were being blown by the movement of space, as if by fans on all sides. The moment the space accelerated to top speed, an invisible cloak began to surround her. The impressions overwhelmed KLEIO, and when she was about to lose consciousness, the room came to an abrupt halt. Her feet dug into grainy sand, and she stood high to her ankles in ocean water, while a wave brushed her calves. She was standing on tropical shores, looking out at the vast ocean. Fresh air on her skin, the salty smell of the sea in her nostrils. She was certainly no longer in Berlin. The city had lacked such tranquil beaches for millions of years. She was completely elsewhere. She thought of how freezing it was yesterday, and for a moment enjoyed the sight of the tropical island on whose coast she was stranded. A white strip of sand stretched into infinity on both sides, and in the interior of lush vegetation, the land hung in a steep curve, was obscured by deep clouds. At first glance, KLEIO had thought the island had seemed considerably smaller. But now, she might as well have stood on the coast of a continent of a size the world had not seen since Pangaea. A shiver came over her, and her breath was caught as the mist receded. Above the jungle, the sun revealed a mountain range that must have been thousands and thousands of meters high, snow-covered and furrowed by glacial moraines. The way the mountain rose was in contradiction to physics. It became wider at the top. Even thousands and thousands of meters was an understatement. It was absurdly high, unthinkably huge, unless she had shrunk again to the size of an insect. Inexplicably, that very thing seemed unthinkable, because then the ripples and the grains of sand would have been microscopic. Somehow, the landscape seemed to warp with her thought processes. Most likely seemed the most absurd of all. Thinking of something unintentionally was sometimes unpleasant. Under given circumstances, it took on catastrophic dimensions. A tidal wave was looming on the horizon at a height that had never been reached in living memory. It eclipsed the sun. Suddenly, it was night, the sky dark. KLEIO watched the landscape stunned, which violated the laws of nature. A flood of the last days. 100-kilometer-high wall of H2O rolled in at supersonic speed. Just before she was engulfed by it, she held her arms in front of her face, which didn't keep the wave from crushing her petite body. Face first would have been less painful, even if the difference was below a millisecond. Contrary to physical laws, KLEIO did not bear a scratch. Not a hair was bent. At most, her reality was shattered. She found herself surrounded by a white-greyish void that seemed to encompass everything but her. Had never experienced a feeling of isolation as omnipresent as in this place that was not a place. A sterile vacuum, milky and immeasurable. There was a gravity. A floor carried her, although it was identical with infinity.
What is happening here?
She asked the elements. There was no one else around.
I want it to stop. Make it stop.
She whimpered, sobbing, and sank her head in her lap.
Can you maybe despair a little more quietly?
A man's voice asked sullenly out of nowhere, and KLEIO startled.
Some of us are trying to relax here.
Whether she was fantasizing just no longer bothered her, with a whimsical figure as it lay there before her. It surpassed the incomprehensibility of a world's end, the environment in which it revealed itself, an opposite and original form of apocalypse, an unveiling that rather matched up with the mother of all wacky dreams.